Hey guys, our group this semester chose preference assessment as our topic to research, and I more specifically wanted to look at the changes in preference and those individual differences that go along with those changes, and also the frequency of preference assessments. So I'm going to be talking about the efficacy of the different preference assessments, how often you should conduct these preference assessments, and then the different factors that attribute to different preference changes. So individual differences, motivating operations, and also conditioning histories play a role in that. One of the characteristics of individuals with ASD is that they have difficulty communicating their preferences. A method to assist individuals with ASD in communicating their preferences is to conduct preference assessments. There are many different forms of preference assessments, but ones involving direct presentation of the potentially preferred items have the most empirical support. While preference assessments have been shown to identify valid reinforcers for individuals with ASD, little research has been conducted on how often preference assessments should be conducted. Research has shown that in individuals, preference changes over time, but not much is known about stability of preference or about the different variables affecting preferences. And this leads to my research topic that I'm going to focus on. This presentation will demonstrate that while many effective preference assessment methods are successful at identifying reinforcers for individuals with ASD, it still remains unclear how often preference assessments need to be conducted to ensure the efficacy of the reinforcers identified. While I was compiling research articles this semester along with my team, I kind of noticed that a lot of the researchers didn't assess how often an individual's preference changed. And if they did look at that, a lot of them were conflicting. Some said that they changed a lot, some said that they remained kind of stable. So that's one of the main reasons why I kind of wanted to focus on that aspect of preference assessments. In a study by Mason, McGee, Farmer, Dugan, and Risley, the authors assessed whether child-selected reinforcers versus teacher-selected reinforcers would result in decreased rates of maladaptive behavior, decreased rates of out-of-seat behavior, and increased rates in correct responding. The authors also assessed the changes in preferences of children with ASD over a 1-month time period. Before the beginning of the intervention phase, a comprehensive reinforcer preference assessment was conducted for each participant. At the beginning of each session, mini preference assessments were conducted in which items found to be preferred during the initial preference assessment were presented in pairs. While the initial preference assessment was effective at finding potent reinforcers for each child, the children's preference during the mini preference assessment varied from session to session. Out of 49 mini preference assessments conducted during the study, only 4 sessions resulted in the child choosing the same pattern of items across 2 consecutive sessions. The mini preference assessments relied on items rated as high during the initial comprehensive preference assessment. This comprehensive preference assessment was never duplicated, so the preference of the items used during the mini preference assessments might have shifted as well. This study demonstrates that preferences change over time as much as across a 1-month time period, but it does not address how frequently preference assessments should be conducted. However, such fluctuation in preferences has not been demonstrated in other studies. In a study by Carr, Nicholson, and Higby, a more efficient method of conducting the MSWO preference assessment was assessed along with changes of a client's preference over a 1-month time frame. The study examined each participant's shift in preference over time by assessing the results of 8 ongoing MSWO preference assessments. For 2 of the 3 participants, the results of the MSWO assessments did not fluctuate across the 1-month time period. Since preference for one participant did fluctuate over time, it suggests that the frequency of preference changes over time may be due to personal differences. Unlike the Mason et al. Study, the current study demonstrates that preference is quite stable over time. This discrepancy in the literature further adds to the need for additional research to be conducted to assess how frequently preference assessments need to be conducted. This study also suggests that the frequency of preference assessments need to be conducted may vary on an individual basis based on how quickly the individual preferences alter. One issue with the Mason et al. And Carr et al. Studies is that they both have a small pool of participants. Thus, Zhao, Iwata, Goff, and Shore assess the changes in preference with 22 adults with ASD. During the study, 2 preference assessments were conducted approximately 16 months apart. For each participant, 15 leisure items were selected. During the assessment, 1 item was handed to the participant and the experimenter did not interact with the participant. The experimenter clocked duration of time spent manipulating the object for each 2-minute session. The results of the study varied greatly for each participant. The composite scores showed that 13 participants engaged with items for a longer period of time during the second assessment. An item-by-item analysis revealed that the change in duration varied greatly between subjects. For example, 1 participant demonstrated an increase in duration of handling for each item, while another participant increased duration of handling for items that were ranked the lowest during the initial assessment. While 13 participants experienced great variety between the initial and subsequent assessment, the study also resulted in 10 participants who engaged with each item for similar durations during the initial and subsequent assessments. This further suggests that individual differences are important to take into account when deciding how often to conduct preference assessment because some individuals' preferences change more rapidly than others' preferences. Also, since the time between the study's first and second assessment varied greatly, it ranged from 12 to 20 months apart, it is unclear how often preference assessments needed to be conducted to account for these changes in preference. While the Zhao et al. Study found that the stability of preference across a long period of time varies dependent on the individual, it still remains unclear what variables lead to such differences. Hanley, Iwata, and Roscoe examined the issue by conducting multiple preference assessments with leisure items for 10 individuals with ASD over a 3 to 6 month period. A paired stimulus preference assessment was conducted with 9 potentially reinforcing items. The same items were used during subsequent preference assessments across a 2 to 6 month period. The items used during the preference assessments were not readily available outside of the sessions. Contrary to previous findings, the current study found that for 80% of participants, preferences were consistent. Attempting to figure out possible causes for shifts in preference, the authors provided continued access to high preference items and paired them with low preference items with edibles and social praise. Both of these manipulations resulted in changes in preference. This suggests that changes in establishing operations or condition histories can contribute to shifts in preference that occur over time. This study further suggests that individual preferences can influence how frequently preference assessments need to be conducted. Also, this study shows that different experiences the individual encounters in the environment can affect how his or her preferences are altered. This study also does not address how often preference assessments should be conducted. Whereas the previous studies focused on leisure activities, Sisson, Graf, and Ahern examined the long-term stability of edible item preferences. During Study 1, the edible preference assessments were conducted 6 months apart, and during Study 2, the preference assessments were conducted 12 months apart. While there were still individual variations in stability, the most and least preferred edible items were more stable across time than the leisure item research studies. This study also demonstrated that consistency was greater during Study 1 when only 6 months had elapsed between the preference assessments. Another interesting result is that 3 out of the 8 participants' rank order coefficients were significant across Study 1 and 2. Similar to the Zhao et al. Article, this suggests that certain individuals may be more likely to have consistent preferences, whereas some individuals' preferences may change more frequently. However, it still remains unclear how frequently preference assessments should be conducted. While preference assessment methods can quickly and effectively identify reinforcers for individuals with ASD, it still remains unclear how often preference assessments need to be conducted to ensure the efficacy of the reinforcers identified. Overall, each study had some variation in the changes in preferences across participants. Also, the results of the studies demonstrated that regardless of the time span, some individuals had stable preferences while others had variable preferences. This suggests the frequency of conducting preference assessments may be assessed on an individual basis. While it remains uncertain, these variations in preference fluctuations may be due to personal differences or changes in the environment such as deprivation, satiation, or the conditioning history of the item. More research is needed to assess how often preference assessments need to be conducted to ensure the efficacy of the reinforcers identified for each individual. Thank you guys. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. And also, I hope you have a happy and safe Thanksgiving.